In the Dark Knight films, the role of Ra's al Ghul was played by Liam Neeson. Now, this take on the character was definitely a much more Nolanized take on the character, but that's not necessarily a complaint. As a matter of fact, I would go on record and say that out of all the characters that were greatly altered for this line of films, I think I was the biggest fan of this one specifically, because I felt that the alterations that were made benefited the narrative, and still felt true to the character, creating a valid version of the villain, in spite of the fact it coming with some variations. While this wasn't the character from the comics to a T, it's hard to argue that the Dark Knight's Demon's Head didn't still feel like that character from the comics, once again, albeit with a few deviations. In the comics, Ra's al Ghul is thought of as immortal, constantly cheating death with the aid of a Lazarus pit, an all-curing green goo bubble bath that restores and resurrects its occupants, surviving traumatic injuries that would kill mere men, and even succumbing to such wounds, but then returning from the afterlife after the fact. Now, in this trilogy, Ra's al Ghul is also referred to as immortal, but it's his teachings and his legacy that make the man immortal.
Oh, there are many forms of immortality.
Which I think is a really creative reimagining that works well for the character, and more importantly, works well for this version of the character. Ra's al Ghul will live forever, whether that be as man or myth. Quite frankly, I love that. As the Nolan series decided to bring the mythos into some semblance of reality, grounding the Bat in the world he once flew in, this change not only made sense, but it still managed to stay true to the spirit of the source. He's a trainer, he's a teacher. His means of educating are through reckless and relentless manners. But there is method to his madness. He prepares his underlings not just for the war that he's waging, but for the unpredictable obstacles that life can throw at them. He may seem merciless in nature at times, but he's merely acting as a stand-in for life itself. As one's opponent isn't likely to show empathy, neither is he. On one hand, the actor feels right at home in the part. Liam Neeson is no stranger to speeches, being a mentor to the main character, and just generally being terrifying in his own sophisticated way. All traits that you'd hope to find in a Ra's performance. He played both friend and foe equally well, coming off as an all-knowing sage in the first act, and a well-meaning destructive force in the final act. Never once feeling like the performance had changed, but rather it was now being viewed under a different light. He plays this part to perfection. Never once coming off as a mustache-twirling stereotypical bad guy, but rather a deeply complex character jaded with the world that he lives in, and finding a means to change it, for better or worse. He's essentially an eco-terrorist with a regime to rival the worst secret societies. The League of Shadows is properly named, as its leader lurks in those shadows, acting as an apprentice to a decoy superior, though it would seem that this point is missed on select members of the fanbase. This seemed to confuse a lot of audiences still to this day. I've had a number of people in my comment section try to incorrectly correct me on this character, saying that this part wasn't Ra's al Ghul playing the part of Henry Ducard, but rather Ra's al Ghul being a title that the leader of the League carries, with Henry Ducard stepping in and fulfilling that role after the original Raz's death. While I don't necessarily hate that conceptually, for this set of films specifically, given a lot of the context in these movies, it's clear that that's not actually the case. Case in point, when Talia shows up and states that she's the daughter of Ra's al Ghul.
Child of Ra's al Ghul may decline.
But he's not the child of Ra's al Ghul. I am.
That would be a strange introduction to have if Ra's was just a title as opposed to a name. Additionally, why wouldn't Talia or Bane ever carry the Ra's moniker? If their goal was to continue the Shadow's destiny, you would think that they'd be considered as such. But even prior to that in Batman Begins, upon Bruce reuniting with his former mentor, he greets him with this line.
Or cheap parlor tricks to conceal your true identity, Ra's.
Because he now sees past the ruse and recognizes Raz's true identity. This was always just a strategy. This was always a strategy. It's one that he taught to Bruce Wayne, one that he utilizes in his own skill set. Which is also why after this reveal, the character is never referred to as Ducard again, because it's a false identity. Not unlike some of the false aliases the real Ra's, the one from the comics I mean, took on in his earlier years, centuries before meeting Batman. The bigger problem with this part isn't the performance itself, but rather the casting. Liam Neeson is an Irish actor playing what is a Chinese and Arabic character in the comics. I want to make it clear, I don't take issue with race-swapping characters, as long as the actor portraying the character still carries themselves in the same manner as that character. But in certain cases, such as this, the character's ethnic background can play into the character's backstory. I mean, for Christ's sake, the man's name is Ra's al Ghul, not Craig McGuffin. Being born a nomad in the 15th century. Not to mention the league he leads seems to mostly be made up of people of color. So you would think maybe he would also be a person of color. Now you can argue that the decoy Ra's al Ghul is meant as a stand-in for that, but even in saying that, they cast Japanese actor Ken Watanabe to play the role and he only had about 4 lines of dialogue. I'm not trying to make some sort of statement, nor am I rallying an audience to come cancel the Nolan brothers, but what I am saying is that this is a little bit of a demerit against the depiction. It does take away from my enjoyment of the role a little bit, though in spite of this relatively big change, this is a mostly faithful adaptation of this antagonist. It actually might be the most faithful recreation of a rogue that these movies have to offer, a spot that's maybe shared with the Scarecrow from this trilogy. Liam Neeson is unsurprisingly great. He did justice to the man who saw justice in an unjust world with his own injustice. What?
Why the f would he say that?
What I really appreciate about this antagonist, though, is that he ties the trilogy together. Make no mistake, Ra's al Ghul is the most important character in these movies, not named Batman. The way Bruce fights, the trickery that he uses, all of this was once a part of Raz's trainings. He's utilizing the mastery of his mentor. And even beyond that, Ra's al Ghul's teachings are still very much implanted in Bruce and implemented by Batman, whether he's entirely conscious of that or not.
Criminals aren't complicated, Alfred. A criminal is not complicated.
His methods and beliefs still play a part in Batman's worldviews. Even after the character has died, his impact is still felt, sending off a ripple effect in this universe that shakes the course of events in the future. He is the catalyst of chaos, responsible for Batman and the vast majority of enemies that he encounters, being the focal point in flashbacks in the first film, until inevitably becoming the focal point of the finale, being mentioned and subtly referenced in the second movie, and being the motive of the main antagonists in the third installment. The man may be dead, but his legacy still lives on, which sort of mirrors Raz's mantra.
But is Ra's al Ghul immortal?
This may not be the most faithful iteration of the bad guy. I think that we've gotten a couple more over the years that seem a little bit closer, but I don't think you can deny that it's one of the greatest. It has its faults and flaws, and more importantly, deviations of the demon, but it's strong enough to stand as its own unique take on the character. It feels like the same character, though still somehow feels drastically different. I've always liked it, but in rewatching these movies for this video, I was surprised by just how much I loved it. Liam Neeson deserves all the praise that he's gotten, and all the praise he's yet to get.
I'm still a believer in the Batman, even if you're not.
I've spoke previously about the Dark Knight's Joker, Two-Face, Bane, and even the Dark Knight's Dark Knight. So now it only seems appropriate to discuss one of the less discussed characters from Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy. I'm talking about the Dark Knight's Robin. While my criticisms of other characters from this set of films has been met with some backlash, I can't imagine this one being treated the same. Because I think for the most part, most people would agree that The Dark Knight Rises really failed Robin. Of all the characters Christopher Nolan reimagined, this one may be the one that he misunderstood. But to be fair, I think a lot of general audiences also misinterpreted this adaptation of the character. By the time the movie ends, I think the general public left the theater scratching their heads thinking, this guy's gonna go on to be the Boy Wonder? The truth of the matter is that this Robin was never meant to really be Robin.
You should use your full name. I like that name. Robin.
Why did you say that name? Why did you say that name? Why did you say that name?
The end reveal of John Blake's birth name being Robin, while laughable, wasn't meant to explain who this character was supposed to be, but was rather meant to symbolize what this character was supposed to be. This wasn't a direct interpretation of any of Batman's major sidekicks. This wasn't supposed to be any Robin in particular, but rather a collective amalgamation of the many Robins that were out at the time. John Blake isn't some stand-in for Dick Grayson, Jason Todd, or Tim Drake. He's a wholly original character created from the ribs of each of these sidekicks. There's a little bit of each of these boy wonders in this junior detective. Like Dick Grayson and Jason Todd, he grew up an orphan, losing his parents at a relatively young age. Also like the first boy wonder, he grew up and got involved with law enforcement for the most noble of reasons. Personality-wise, he's a baby-faced do-gooder, much like the first Robin was. But there's also a little bit of an attitude and an edge to him, much like the second Robin. However, I think the biggest comparison there is to make, though, is between John and the third Robin, Tim Drake. Like Tim, he was an expert detective at a young age, putting in the work and critical thinking before he was ever granted a position of power, whether that be a cape or a badge. He had expert deduction skills and was an incredible investigator, all before he was actually an investigator. As a matter of fact, the scene in which John Blake seeks out Bruce Wayne and casually confronts him about knowing his dual identity, well, that's practically taken straight out of the comics. In Tim Drake's first ever appearance, Tim, an outsider, a complete stranger to the Batman family, approaches Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson during one of their darkest times, revealing that he knows their darkest secrets, putting together clues that not even Gotham's greatest detectives could piece together, figuring out the identity of not only Batman, but of his wards and sidekicks alike. In a lot of ways, Tim's intellect, and more importantly his belief in Batman, is what saves Batman. In both the movie and the original story, Bruce is beyond hesitant of bringing another individual into his secret life. And in both cases, it's due to the death of a loved one at the hands of the Joker. And in both cases, it's a murder of someone who died because they shared that secret with Bruce. Though ultimately, in both cases, Bruce learns to trust the young man and allows him to work alongside him. And while the character's detective skills were showcased throughout his time on screen, sometimes the way in which he came to the right conclusion is just short of baffling. Like, long story short, he was able to figure out that Bruce Wayne was Batman because he saw him make a face one time as a kid.
That's strange.
I mean, the answer's right, but by all means, the math that you did leading up to it.
Well, you got me. By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
While John Blake was the proverbial Robin of this trilogy, I still wouldn't classify him as a Robin, nor did they ever intend for him to be. He was sort of a tribute act that paid homage to every sidekick that came before him, an ode to the past that was designed to have the torch passed down to him, to carry on the mantle in an unseen future. And while I really think that premise is interesting, I think in execution it falls short. First and foremost, Batman is Bruce's life's work. It's not just a separate identity, but in many ways it's his actual real-life self. Sure, it's not his government name, but it is his legitimate personality and passion. I think in a tried-and-true telling of the Batman story, he'd only leave the mantle by circumstances that are far outside his control, meaning death or complete inability to do the job. While the movie did showcase the fact that Bruce was getting older, and was considerably beaten up from the time that he's put in, I still don't think that that would stop him at his current stage. I'm not saying it shouldn't have stopped him. Any sound-minded individual experiencing that much pain and aches probably would hang up the cape and cowl. But Bruce isn't a sound-minded individual. He might be smarter than the people that he comes up against, but he's not any more sane. He is a man driven by a need for justice and vengeance, sometimes not being able to tell the two apart. Even with Gotham being seemingly cleared up, I don't believe that justice has a jurisdiction. I mean, he's pretty much proven as much when he flew far outside the bounds of Gotham City to apprehend a criminal in Hong Kong. So going off to live happily ever after while leaving the role of Batman in someone else's capable hands feels like a really improper ending for him. Because being Batman was more than just a mission. Being Batman was more important to him than being Bruce. I don't think that that mentality would ever end. But brushing that aside and focusing solely on just the mission, I don't think Bruce would willingly let himself be removed from it. I feel like Batman Beyond handled this story incredibly well. Because while Bruce was no longer capable of being Batman, he still felt as if he was Batman. He was still deeply involved and attached to the mission at hand, training the next generation of superhero via Bluetooth. In football terms, if Batman is too concussed and beaten down to play quarterback, he would resign the rest of his life to sitting on the sidelines playing coach. There is no retirement for him. Not really. Sure, he wasn't out there on the fields, but he was still given plays. Now granted, there have been several times where several Robins have stepped up and took over the Batman mantle, usually following injury or in some cases, death. But they did so after years and years of compelling stories that were driven by character development. They were integral individuals in both sides of the main character's personal and professional lives. People who understood him on such a deep and complicated level. They knew what Batman would or wouldn't do because they were all trained by Batman. Not only do they have sufficient training of their own, but they had a pseudo-career in caped crime fighting. They are worthy temporary replacements, and some even successors. But John Blake is not any of that. John Blake does not have an intimate knowledge of all things Batman. All things considered, all he is a smart stranger. Bruce feels that he can trust him. But he's been wrong before. Wrong in a big way. Recently, actually. He was wrong in this movie. He trusted Talia Al Ghul. So why is he so quick to just assume John Blake's a good dude? He knows nothing about him. He doesn't even know his first name. It feels a little bit reckless to just up and give this no one the keys to the Batcave and say, go get him, kid. I mean, sure, yeah, it's reckless for Batman to take a 12-year-old as a sidekick, but at the very least, they have his supervision. Batman was there to play mentor and teacher and make sure that they were going down the right path, doing whatever he could to keep them out of the danger that he just introduced them to. Bruce Wayne feels completely careless by the end of this. Like he already decided that he was on his way out, so he didn't care whose hands he left the city in, as long as they weren't his. I understand that this is a movie, and that obviously it wouldn't be afforded the same time to tell this type of story, especially when there's a larger story at hand. This was always going to be a side quest. But making Robin's reckoning and his own rise to the Batman mantle a short, condensed side quest is deeply misguided, and does a disservice to the character and the character's importance, even in this movie's own narrative. This guy is supposed to be the next Batman, the second coming of the Dark Knight, the one that will rise as this one falls. In actuality, he's treated as a complete afterthought. If they were going to incorporate a Robin arc, maybe they should have had the foresight to set it up in the first or second movie. They had 2 films before they completed this trilogy. You'd think that they could have told a little bit of his story in the background before having it come to a satisfying conclusion in the 3rd act of this trilogy. Rather than introduce the character in the 1st act of the 3rd act of this trilogy, and having a conclusion for the character at the end of the 3rd act of the 3rd act of this trilogy. It's been said before that a Robin wouldn't work in the Dark Knight films. Both Christopher Nolan and Christian Bale have said as much in interviews prior to making The Dark Knight Rises. And be that the case, maybe they shouldn't have used any form of the character at all. If a puzzle piece won't fit in place, you don't then bite the edges off to adjust properly. It means that it's not the right piece of the puzzle. Find another one. At the end of the day, I think that John Blake is a soulless, paper-thin Nolanization of the mantle, making him the next generation of Batman, as opposed to first making him his own unique standalone character. Furthermore, I think it falls short as its own original character as well. We don't spend enough time with John Blake to really care about him. We have some insight into his ideals and values, but we only have the most basic of knowledge of him. That doesn't really make for a bright or compelling future of the franchise. As stated before, it's an unseen future intentionally left up to the viewer's imagination. But when the creation of such a character was so unimaginative, it doesn't give the audience a whole lot to work with. I don't know that fans watching the movie really wanted to see not Tim Drake put on the cape, let alone for that cape to be Batman's. It's an underwhelming end to the Batman brand, an unfitting ultimate send-off. That's not to say Joseph Gordon-Levitt did anything wrong, just that he feels like the wrong choice for a Batman successor. If I take his role as Robin and his role as Batman out of the equation, there's not much left to this role at all. John Blake might as well have been named John Blank, because this guy is an empty canvas. We don't know about the man that he is, meaning that we know even less about the Batman he will become. John Blake is somehow an overwritten reference and an underwritten character. But again, I want to restate, I don't think the character was necessarily bad, because I don't think it was ever even given a chance to be. It's acted out just fine, but it's drastically underwritten and underdeveloped. For me, he is a Robin in name only. I talk a lot about the Dark Knight films here on the channel, and I also talk a lot about recast roles. which is why today's topic combines both of these subjects as you join me in taking a look back at The Dark Knight's Rachel Dawes and the women who played her. In Batman Begins, the part was portrayed by Katie Holmes, fresh off the creek, whereas in The Dark Knight, the role was recast with Maggie Gyllenhaal as the leading lady. Now, this character isn't from the comics and is original to this set of films specifically, and I think her inclusion is a pretty inspired choice, all things considered. I mean, this character is actually a lot more important than I think a lot of people give it credit for. A lot of the time, she's just written off as being Batman's girlfriend, which is something I myself am guilty of calling her, but that's usually just done for comedic effect. Giving Batman a lifelong friend helps ground Bruce Wayne, which is desperately needed for a man who spends his nightlife in the sky. Rachel is his rock, attempting to tie him down to a social life, stopping the man from getting lost within the myth that he's created. Her inclusion further humanizes this character and gives a false sense of hope for our hero to live a life with some sort of normality, serving not only as a close friend and confidant to Bruce Wayne, but also his primary love interest. Not that Bruce Wayne has ever had a problem with women. In the previous set of Batman films, Bruce had quite the dating life for a man who arguably has no legitimate social life, having a different woman on his arm in each installment. There was a revolving door of love interest for this Batman. But then again, there was also a revolving door of Bruce Waynes for this Batman, so I guess it fits. Now, in contrast to that, in The Dark Knight, the relationship with Rachel is at least more consistent, even if ultimately there wasn't an actual relationship there to speak of. Ironically enough, this delationship was much more substantial. In the first film, Holmes got a lot of hate for her performance, and honestly, I don't think that she was terrible in the role, but I also don't think that she was always believable in the part. She has this very confused way of delivering dialogue. She seems so unsure of what it is that she's saying at every given moment. Ultimately, I would rule her out as being mediocre.
Mediocre?
But I don't think it's entirely her fault. At the time, Katie just didn't seem mature enough for this. She kind of felt like a child wearing their parents' clothing, trying their best to look and act like a real grown-up, but never coming off as anything more than someone playing pretend.
Rachel is more of the on top of things type of girl.
What does that mean?
You can also probably attribute it to her style of acting. While it was right at home in a teen drama, it wasn't necessarily welcomed in a blockbuster Batman flick.
Go-getter. She knows what she wants, and she's, doing it.
What does that mean? No one knows what that means.
A lot of the time, she just comes off like a generic damsel in distress. And that's in spite of the movie trying to give her a purpose. She's in need of saving multiple times in the movie. And even at the end, when she manages to save herself, it doesn't feel like this grandiose moment that I think it's meant to be. Mainly because it's a moment that's undercut by everything else that's going on at the time. This stand up for yourself segment is lost within a sea of other pivotal plot points happening at the same time. And it's also immediately forgotten, and there's not a lot of attention put on it because they're trying to get to the next story beat. It doesn't give you time to properly process and digest this. And what should have been development for the character is lost within disinterest for the character. Not to mention that she lacks any sort of romantic chemistry with her alleged love interest. I don't know, I just don't see sparks flying between these two. They do seem to have some sort of connection. I can buy a long-standing friendship between her and him, but they really come off as platonic childhood friends. And the romance between the two feels a bit forced, which is unfortunate given this character's importance to the plot. Rachel is a deciding factor in Bruce's mission. She is one of the very few people who can actually influence the Dark Knight. His love for her is so strong that the mere sight of her causes him to uncharacteristically break character, completely dropping his act in her presence. There's definitely something meaningful here, but I can't buy it past a friendship. That just doesn't seem to be the energy between these two. However, I can't say the same for her successor. In my opinion, and from what I can tell it's a pretty common one, this role was a lot more meaningful when Maggie Gyllenhaal was portraying the part. Maggie Gyllenhaal gives Rachel a bit more personality, and a lot more of a backbone. This Rachel was not shy about standing up for herself. Like her predecessor, she was job-obsessed and justice-motivated. But now she seems a lot more legitimate, for lack of a better word. Her passion for her work comes through. And sure, that's helped by having more scenes that see her in her chosen profession, but I think it's also helped greatly by the way that Maggie carried herself. She had a level of professionalism, and you could tell that she wasn't just reciting lawyer jargon. She feels as if she's deeply involved in her line of work. Although, considering this, I have to question the character's choice not to date Bruce, because she feels that he's too involved in his crime-fighting career, when she herself is too involved in her crime-fighting career, and then goes on to date Harvey Dent, who is equally, if not more, involved in his crime-fighting career. That one still got me scratching my head and rubbing my chin like this image of Batman that I'm showing you. And I know how much you guys love this image.
Oh, make it stop! Make it stop!
I don't know, maybe she's just more into blondes and needed a way to let Bruce down. Could be. But that part has always confused me. Now, speaking on the romance, or no-mance between the two, I actually happen to buy it a lot more with this actress. I believe the romance between her and Bruce. Well, past tense. It genuinely feels like there's some unresolved issues and feelings there, complicated by a long-standing friendship and very different yet similar lives. This Rachel is walking a tightrope, because while she loves Bruce, she's clearly in love with Harvey Dent, and she doesn't want to hurt the person that she's known her whole life. This complicates matters, and creates a love triangle that doesn't feel too staged. It's a very real scenario, and not one that anyone would want to find themselves in. Despite them having even less of a romance in this film than they did in the first one, it feels much more like a romance in this film than it did in the first one. And that's just based on how illegitimate the first pairing felt. Maggie's Rachel doesn't feel like a plot point, even though she kinda is, because she's really only around to follow up the end of Batman Begins and create an additional tension between two of the leads. But it's not as brutally blatant as it was prior, and a big part of that is because of how likable Maggie's Rachel is. I'm not saying that she was the life of the party here, but she was at least, a person. Aside from her place in the story and her place in Bruce's life, these two characters are not at all alike, despite them actually being the same exact character. It's a part played by two different people with two very different approaches to it. And because of that, there's a lot more to contrast these two than there is to compare. They tried to dress this actress up like the previous one, they tried to stylize her hair the same, and in spite of that, never once does this feel like the same character. And you know what? Maybe that's for the best. From a continuity standpoint, it's a little bit jarring, but from a pure entertainment perspective, it's hard to argue against the fact that they did the right thing when the second film came out. There have been many Batman bad guys brought to the big screen over the years, but there's only been one who's been asked to return in every sequel in its franchise. The Scarecrow is the only villain to appear in all three pieces of the Dark Knight trilogy, acting as a secondary antagonist in the first film, and a cameo in the second and third. A fact which should speak volumes about this actor's performance. He clearly left an impression on the movie makers and the movie audience alike. And that's because Cillian Murphy is the perfect Scarecrow, or more accurately, the perfect Jonathan Crane. Dr. Crane in these movies is a genuinely unwell and unsettling man. At first he can come off as a little bit strange, but later you realize that he's truly deranged. He's quite literally the inmate running the asylum. Even in normal situations, the character comes off as noticeably abnormal. The tone of his voice, his mannerisms, his very nature, it all just feels a little bit off. It's unnerving, but in a much more subdued and subtle way. You wouldn't necessarily alert the authorities upon meeting him, but you would actively avoid him following a first impression.
Having said that,
there were still several missteps and misfires with this villain. The problem isn't with how the character was depicted necessarily, but instead his place in the story. This variant of the villain is tragically misused, being set up as the movie's main antagonist before revealing him to be a mere pawn in the real Big Bad's plan. This change of pace makes the Scarecrow come off as a goofy underling more than an actual threat to the hero. And that point is furthered when in the climax, the Scarecrow is easily dismantled by Batman's girlfriend. Not exactly the grand send-off you'd want to see for this character. Granted, a taser shot on horseback was not something I thought I'd see, but it's not something I ever really was asking for either. Unfortunately, this problem also makes him an entirely too accurate adaptation of the antagonist, as the Scarecrow from the comics and the TV shows has met a very similar fate. The character is familiar to fans and casual viewers alike, but this character's almost never put on display the way he probably should be. The Scarecrow character feasts on fear, using one's own deepest, darkest terrors against them, manifesting his victims' anxiety, and giving audiences a better understanding of all these characters by digging deep into their psyches. That's some pretty heavy stuff. Even outside his own backstory and characterization, the Scarecrow works as a very strong plot device that allows audiences to gain a new perspective and deeper comprehension of the characters that they're watching or reading about. But more often than not, the character is not written to be the foe of focus, being instead utilized as an apprentice of another antagonist or just a narrative afterthought. It's really unfortunate because there are so many stories to be told using this villain, and yet there are next to no stories being told with this villain specifically. Though that's not the only issue with this character. For as great of a Jonathan Crane as Cillian Murphy is, his character arc never feels complete. His development is stilted very early on into his criminal career, and he doesn't ever fully feel like the Scarecrow. This feels like the villain in its infancy, like a Scarecrow the early years, except he never makes it past the prequel. At times, he can even come off as a little bit goofy, which on one hand is fine, because Jonathan Crane is a little bit goofy. That's a part of the premise of the character. He spent years of being overlooked and under-acknowledged. And while he may be unhinged, he's also unassuming. He's a frail and feeble man, who was often either the butt of jokes or the victim of abuse. And in spite of his blatant bizarre demeanor, he's just not naturally intimidating. It's only through the use and abuse of fear itself that he's able to terrorize the citizens of the city. And here, I don't think he ever succeeds at that. Even with the use of the toxin, he's never taken seriously. When his victims are shown to be in peril, it's never of him. He's not playing into the use of fear gas. He's just using the fear gas. If you don't understand what I'm trying to say, let me try to put it like this. The Scarecrow doesn't just spray his victims and then leave them to their own devices. He terrorizes them. He manipulates their fear because he enjoys the power that he has over them. It makes him feel validated. This is an important element of the character that was lost in translation. Now sure, you can claim that he attempted to do this once, but for the most part, he's only shown using it as a diversion to mask his escape, which can be a function, but the fact that it's its primary function feels like a flaw. The movies never dive deeper into the psychological impact that Scarecrow's toxins can have on people, nor does it offer up unique visuals providing a better understanding of that character. The fear-based illusions don't seem to be tailored to their victims specifically. Instead, it just shows them generic spooky stuff. We get brief flashes of allegedly scary things, and people making goofy faces in response. For me, this was one of the movie's biggest mistakes, especially being a Christopher Nolan flick. He should have gone full Inception with this aspect of the story. One thing I've come to really dislike about this, in spite of all that I actually like about it, is that we never learn of this character's backstory or motivations. Unfortunately, a lot of Crane is very underestablished. Because of his place in the story, not much is known about him, as ultimately he's only a red herring put in place to mask the dual identity of Henry Ducard. We know precious little about this version of the character, and it sadly makes this villain feel like a glorified plot point in the grand scheme of things. We continue to see the character after in lesser cameos, but at no point does he ever feel fully realized. He's still the same goof hiding behind the power that he wields, but also doing next to nothing with that power. He doesn't effectively master fear, and that's definitely disappointing, because I'm pretty sure that Cillian Murphy could have done something really interesting if given the chance to showcase that side of the character. Don't get me wrong, I'm appreciative of the work that we've gotten. I like the character that audiences received, and even a lot of the direction of Christopher Nolan. And regardless of what I feel is a bit of a misuse of the character, there's no doubting that Cillian Murphy was great as the Scarecrow. But I can't help but feel that the character would have been even greater if given the right environment and the right presentation. Even with the issues with this iteration, I wouldn't argue that it's the greatest live-action portrayal of the character that we've ever gotten. It's still pretty great. While the Dark Knight trilogy is made up of career-defining, award-winning villain performances, there's one that is usually seen as the bottom of the barrel, and that's the topic of today's video, Talia Al Ghul. Now, first and foremost, I want to say that that's a really unfair comparison to make any of the time. Hold any villain performance to the Dark Knight's Joker, Scarecrow, or even Ra's al Ghul, and most would pale in comparison. I know I've criticized some of these in the past, but the problem with those portrayals was never the actual performance. Instead, it was the perception of these characters. All these performances on their own are top tier. I don't think anyone with good taste can dispute that. But very often, they didn't feel like the characters that they were based on. I feel that Marion Cotillard's time as Talia Al Ghul very much falls into that same category. There are definitely moments of truly terrible acting here. Like, that might just be the least convincing death scene I've ever seen in a major motion picture.
It's done.
However, outside of these few awkwardly acted moments, I truly think the actress brought her A-game. The sometimes strange choices that are made are very few and far between. As her persona, Miranda Tate, she inspires hope in our winged friend. It's through her kindness and seeming sincerity that she's able to earn Bruce's trust, acting as a confidant for the once secluded and isolated Wayne. She's good-hearted, well-meaning, and is able to see the good in the world, in spite of being aware of all the accompanying bad. She's also able to see through Bruce's persona, recognizing his heart through his disguise. She really nailed this side of the role, and made for a believable love interest for our hero. As a matter of fact, I would actually say that I believe that there was a lot more chemistry between the two than there was between Bale and both actresses that played his best friend turned almost girlfriend Rachel Dawes. They were much more believable as an item, and in my opinion, there was also a better story between them than
Rachel!
Except all of that is just a ruse of the rogue. It's fiction masquerading around as fact. All of this is a facade put on by the villain. Her sincerity was shockingly insincere, as she stabs Batman in the back, or more accurately, the side. As Talia, she's tactical and strategic. She's a master planner who took it upon herself to take the torch from her allegedly demonic dad. She walks in the footsteps of her father. However, I actually think that might be part of the issue with this iteration of the character. When all is said and done, it's just a lesser version of a villain that we've seen before. I understand the concept of a callback. I get that a lot of The Dark Knight Rises was to circle back around to Batman Begins, but the problem is that at some point in time, it just comes off as an inferior remake. Like her father, she hides behind parlor tricks, gaining Bruce's trust by masking her true identity with a fake name, and instilling hope within him. Like Ra's, she's a cunning linguist, articulate as she is diabolical, using her speeches to get across life lessons and build trust within an enemy. The way she speaks feels very reminiscent of Ra's. Even the music cues are identical, with the music accompanying Talia's scenes being the same ones that accompanied her on-screen fathers in the first film. She's far too derivative of what's come before that she hardly gets the opportunity to make any kind of an impression herself. On top of all these problems, Talia doesn't really get a whole lot of screen time. As Miranda Tate, she was a B-plot at best. She was Bruce's second chance at love, a potential future for the character that provided some light when he was in his moments of darkness, taking a backseat to the brutality of Bane, the return of Batman, the subtle origin of this universe's Robin.
I like that name. Robin. Thanks.
As Talia, who is revealed to be the movie's real big bad, she has even less screen time, doing next to nothing of note, and then dying off unceremoniously before she could fully see her plan through. Her true character begins and ends at her reveal. A reveal, mind you, which doesn't really work. Any Batman fan going to the theaters could see this coming from a mile away. Now in the comics, Ra's has a couple of children. At this point in time, he only had 3, 2 daughters and 1 boy. Talia was of course always the most prominent due to her attachment to her father and her devotion to the titular hero. More often than not, she remains seated at her father's side, being the right hand of the demon's head. His other children are far less eminent. They're almost complete unknowns to anyone who isn't deeply familiar with the comics, as neither get a whole lot of play. But his son Dushan, aka the White Ghost, might be the most unknown and underutilized. You could maybe assume that these movies were merging the character together with Bane, but in all honesty, that's not all that likely. The White Ghost is barely used and utilized in the mythos. With all due respect, he's not highly regarded and is mostly discarded. Talia, on the other hand, is equally as famous as her father, appearing alongside him in most of his on-screen and in-comic outings. It's hard to think of one without the other, whereas you could easily think of Rage without ever mentioning his other two children. So when the movie is referring to the masked man as the child of Ra's al Ghul, to most fans of the mythos, it was clear that this was a really obvious red herring. A bait and switch, if you will. Add to it that a new love interest who Bruce has entrusted his earnings with in the plot, and it makes it that much more obvious. Most Batman fans saw this twist coming, which, to be fair, also falls in line with the first film, as a lot of fans predicted that Liam Neeson would in fact be playing Ra's al Ghul rather than Henry Ducard. Although I think this one might have been more on the nose than that. As a fan of the source material, there are some things about this rendition of the Rogue that just don't sit right with me. First and foremost, Talia's love for Batman was always true. It wasn't a front brought on by her or her father's clever plans. Her affections actually almost bordered on the lines of obsession. She was entranced by the Caped Detective. And it was a mutual feeling as well. I've never been a huge fan of this pairing, as I've discussed previously on the channel, but I at least know what it is that I'm not a fan of. Talia's feelings for Bruce weren't disingenuous. The little heart that she had was filled with love for the man underneath the mask. I think having her play the world's greatest detective the way that she did does a disservice to both characters. Batman feels much more gullible considering that he's fallen for the same trap twice in this trilogy, and Talia seems like a much more shallow take on the character who is otherwise conflicted between her need to uphold her father's legacy and her love for her father's adversary. Again, I'm not a fan of the shipping, but I must admit that that's much more compelling than what this movie provided. Additionally, her relationship with Bane definitely differs from how it is in the comics. When the two do interact, Bane is actually interested in the daughter of the Demon's Head. She's one of the very few women he's ever shown any sort of romantic interest in, though she spurns his advances. Here, the two are depicted as being in some sort of sibling scenario. Talia views Bane as her protector, a guardian who took it upon himself to look after her and ensure her survival. I'll tell you what, to be fair, while I can acknowledge that this wouldn't work in the comics due to the characters being of a similar age, here I think it actually makes for a better story arc between the two, and I'd be interested in seeing this potentially translated somewhere else. It makes the bond between the two that much stronger, and I think on some level, it enriches both characters. I actually don't hate this change. It deviates from the source, but I think it adds to the story that it's telling. All in all, I think the character was unfortunately misused. But I think the performance itself, for the most part, is pretty good. The character feels less effective due to how little we see of her, but I don't blame the actress for that. I think she played the part well, but the movie didn't always depict her as well. Regardless, I'm glad that we got to see this iteration of Talia. She deserves more credit than she's given, and I mean that both in terms of the script that she was given and the backlash that the actress received.
In my opinion, Mr. Zsasz is as much a danger to himself as to others.
When most people think about the many villains of the Dark Knight trilogy, they usually think of the career-defining performance of Heath Ledger as the Joker, Liam Neeson as the teacher-turned-threat Ra's al Ghul, Tom Hardy as the intellectual brute Bane. Maybe some even think of the last movie's terrible Talia, or the first film's head of the crime family Carmine Falcone. But most will probably forget Batman Begins as Victor Zsasz. For good reason. The part was played by Tim Booth, who did a good job with what was asked of him, considering all that was asked of him was to look odd and make strange faces. That may sound like a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's actually a very apt description. The character has exactly 0 lines of dialogue all throughout. He never speaks a word, not once. Instead, all the acting comes from his eyes. And quite frankly, that's almost enough. It's almost too much, to be honest with you. To the actor's credit, he does come off as very unnerving. And he does so effortlessly. His glances are cringe-inducing and fear-inspiring. And that's without the benefit of fear toxin. He's clearly a very strange, demented man, and much more importantly, a very bad person. He's an assassin who takes on hits for Gotham's crime families. Zsasz doesn't really play a major role in Batman Begins. He's a much more minor part. He's a small story beat in the movie's main plot. You see, Mr. Zsasz is really just included in the film as fan service for the knowing audience. But it's fan service with a purpose, as he doubles as a means to show the corruption of Dr. Jonathan Crane. You see, the not-so-good doctor is having Falcone's men sent to Arkham Asylum under false pretenses, sending them there to be evaluated, as opposed to letting them serve their sentence at Blackgate Prison. He has them shipped to Arkham where he can keep an eye on them, and most importantly, experiment on them. But the big problem with this narrative here is that Victor Zsasz is not the right character to run this arc with. If the goal was to show Crane as being a liar, diagnosing the stable as legally insane, Zsasz is a really bad choice to do that with, as Victor Zsasz is absolutely legally insane. He's demented, that's the whole basis of his character. If you don't believe me, look at almost every other appearance he's ever made in media. I don't know what inspired Christopher Nolan to use this specific character for this specific story, but it was a mistake. It's not that the story itself is bad, it's that this character is the wrong person to do this story with. This story would have worked much better with characters like Sal Maroni or Black Mask, criminals who are corrupt but not crazed. Strangely enough, despite not speaking a word in the movie, actor Tim Booth would surprisingly reprise the role for the Batman Begins video game, a game in which he was actually given dialogue.
Yeah, I like to watch. Come a little closer.
I'm warning you, Zsasz.
Just a little closer. I want to smell you. I'll leave you your tongue, so you can beg.
Even more odd is that, contradictory to the narrative present, he's depicted as being crazy, which works as an accurate representation of the character, but doesn't work for the narrative surrounding the character in this story. So this is just really a real lose-lose scenario here. Though I will admit, at the very least, it is somewhat entertaining here. And honestly, it just makes me wonder what could have been. For whatever reason, for as small as this part was, it's had some major impact on the character's on-screen career since. In the comics, Victor Zsasz is depicted as being a psychotic serial killer, and nothing more, nothing less. However, here, he's made an assassin for hire, working for the criminal underground of Gotham City, which he would do again in his next on-screen appearance in Gotham, more on that later, and yet again in his follow-up appearance in the movie Birds of Prey. Speaking about his time in Gotham, if you like this video and would like to see a video on the Victor Zsasz from that show, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
How about Victor Zsasz?
Now, before I go, I don't usually do this. I've had a Patreon for a while now, but I've really struggled with what to do with it. Luckily, the time is upon us where I can actually offer you guys exclusive and extended content that I can't make here on the channel. With new restrictions on what kind of content can be monetized or hell, even shown here on the platform, now's as good a time as ever to be placing my completely unaltered, uncensored, extended videos on my Patreon. I don't want to put my videos behind a paywall, but that's kind of the best place to put them for the time being. So if there was ever a time to give a stranger money on the internet, well, I would like to think that now is that time. Just so everyone knows, all the money I make off my Patreon goes directly back into the channel. Everyone who donates to the Patreon will not be seen as a fan, but rather a producer of said content. And you will be credited as such in the closing credits here on the channel. So if you have the time and $1 to spare, help a guy out. If you can't, I appreciate your time and attention nonetheless.
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was V Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time. Same bat channel.